Hello everyone, Revan619 here, and I have spent the weekend absolutely grinding the heck out of the Dark Heresy Alpha. For those of you who might not know, well, let me just quickly inform you. So Dark Heresy is going to be the sort of sequel and spin-off to Rogue Trader, which is being developed by Owlcat Games, and it's going to be going into the Inquisition side of the Rogue Trader universe. So you will play as an Inquisitor acolyte investigating the threat around the Tyrant Star and the impact of the Night Lords, which is an Astartes traitor legion. In this alpha, we have access to until beta goes live, which will be until the full game goes live. So to get into this, you need to buy the Digital Developers Edition from Owlcat's website, though we don't know when beta is going to go live, and we don't know when the full game is going to be out, but I suspect it'll be about a year until the full release, because that's how it worked from the alpha announcement for Rogue Trader. This game is set to completely change the way that we play this, with a new combat system, a new morale system, a new investigation system, and more wider story-based telling. So whilst the game is aimed to be more of a smaller scope than Rogue Trader, it's looked to be more player orientated, to having more impact from the player decisions throughout the game and more impact on the story. So we'll see how that starts to look, and I'll give some of my thoughts on this alpha so far. One of the first things that we're going to immediately notice is the new UI. So as you can see, it's been cleaned up quite a bit and things have been changed around. So we now go based on a wound system for our health points. Our armor is going to be a second health bar rather than the damage reduction that we receive, and our defense is going to be based on our agility, which is basically our dodge. There are going to be other modifiers to this for both melee and range, but that's going to be sort of the main focus for it. You will be able to see your active conditions that you have on your character at the bottom here, as well as being able to see your archetype on the main inventory page, if you have a second tier one, and what your character's influence is. Influence is going to be your threatened area around you, and it's how many cells around you that you'll have access to a lot of abilities. As you can see, we've still got the same returning stats here, but our skills are going to be vastly different, and some of these skills will actually have a part in combat, which you'll see on these checks here. Some of these are actually going to be slightly changed based on your origin, and you'll be gaining stats as well as skills based on the specializations you go into archetypes, but I'll cover that a little bit more when we go into that area. Your offensive stuff is going to also be broken down on this main sheet, so you can see what you've got coming in here, and you're going to still have the same familiar Rogue Trader elements where I'll explain what they do, but weapons are now more specialized, and we will actually start looking at some of that as we go into some of the combat changes, but the weapon roles that you have for each weapon are far more defined. When it comes to the armor rework, you'll actually be able to take armor from different sections, so some gloves will provide armor, some boots will, possibly some helms, but from what I've seen so far in the alpha, the chest piece provides armor as well as the foot piece, and you also do get damage reduction being applied from some heavy armors, but that won't be the case for medium, whereas light characters, they tend not to have any armor at all, so they don't have this second health bar, which is kind of like how temp wounds work. It is very similar to a Divinity Original 2 system, however armor doesn't prevent you from being stunned. It does, however, prevent you from taking vital damage. Vital damage is going to be the extra damage that you receive when you get targeted in a vital spot, such as the head or eyes. This is going to be what a lot of precision-based weapons like sniper rifles and swords are built around. When it comes to the weapons themselves, so some weapons here, like the Bulgrin Mace here, he ignores half of the damage reduction, and if the target is burning, it ignores their full damage reduction. So as you can see here, Cog has 19% damage reduction, meaning if he was on fire and he hit himself, he would completely ignore that damage reduction and then do the standard damage. So there's a lot of other things that you'll see with that on other weapons. Some of them will have stuff like over penetrating, which is where attacks will hit an enemy and then go through to the next one. They'll also have specs where they'll do more damage to target's morale, or even have some other things. So las guns now do extra armor damage, as well as having unique abilities tied to some different ones. Flamers will do stuff like distracting and burning, which will be able to lower enemies like statistics, so they become more of a debuffing weapon. They also seem to ignore cover. Cover is a lot more important in this game because it acts as another shield, so your shots will most likely hit cover. Burning will do extra damage to armor, as well as toxin can also be doing extra damage rest of the person, as well as bleeding. So some of these dots have been slightly reworked, and you will see the return of some abilities such as the knockback, certain weapons having bigger AoE, and other little things like that. Area weapons are much more defined, and I actually found that one of the better weapons in the game was the melters. Because melters do extra armor damage, and with run and gun they can do multiple attacks, they're actually very effective at armor stripping. I did find that shotguns felt very weak because they lost their ability to push back, so I feel like they've lost their identity as a role. But however, area and burst weapons are now much more clearly defined. Burst fire attacks are essentially a high damage single target attack that can sometimes randomly have bullets go stray and hit other targets within that zone. So if you use an ability where you shoot twice, you'll actually not do both attacks if the target dies. So it does require you to actually pinpoint and pick your individual targets a lot more than it previously did. So area weapons will be lower damage, but it will hit everything in the area, whereas burst fire will be high damage to a single target, but there's that risk that it could go off, whereas sniper rifles will be fairly decent single target damage, but they will do incredible vital damage with targeted pinpoint targeting. In order to be able to hit vitals, you're going to need to remove enemies' armor, which is their first HP bar, and then you're going to want to be able to stun them or immobilize them in one way or another, so you can target stuff like their head and eyes because you have restrictions to being able to make those shots. So by abusing team combinations such as CC control, you'll be able to do much better job of being able to hit those vital points and getting up much higher damage. It means that sniper rifles are incredibly effective even for an officer to use. I was finding that an officer was virtually doing the same damage as an operative, and it wasn't until you started really stacking multiple operatives that you actually saw any benefit to having an operative over an officer. The leveling process has been changed, and if you have a look at this little UI here, this will seem much more familiar to you, those of you that come from Kingmaker. Whilst 25 levels might not be the planned end type, it could potentially be the end time, and it could mean that we're only going to see 2 archetypes in the full release. However, whilst some people may be worried that building is going to get dumbed down, it's actually being more focused and refined. So every few levels you get something called a specialization. The way specializations work is it gives you characteristic modifiers and skill modifiers, as well as giving you access to talents that are actually going to be tied to around that. These talents will be what you pick at your talent level ups that will be chosen from your origin, your archetype, and your specializations. As you get more of these, you'll have more options to choose from to create your own characters. Think of it kind of similar to Baldur's Gate 3 style subclasses. You'll also get access to being able to choose different modifications at level ups, and the modification system is something very, very interesting. You can modify individual actions or abilities to do additional things. So such as this one here, Cog can potentially at level up take heavy armor restoration. When the character's armor durability is 0, they regain 12 armor, which is going to be based on 2 times tough bonus, and I could put that to either the Bulwark passive effect, or I could put to the Endure passive effect, so I can choose what's going to be modified. You can only add 1 modification to each ability. More importantly, we also get ability upgrades. So say I go for Forceful Strike here, which is the warrior's melee attacks deal 20% more damage to the enemy's armor. The warrior's melee attacks cost plus 1 AP. I get to pick my talent, which we can see where they all come for. So we've got some for Heavy Armor Specialist, which is going to be his first specialization. We've got some from his origin, which is going to be the Ogren Bonehead. We've got a bunch from his Warrior archetype as well. So then when we go over to, say we wanted to pick one that's going to mitigate morale, which is actually one of the best things to do in the game, but I'll cover that more later in the combat section. I can then pick another talent going into level 5 here. So say I then wanted, say, Ogren Get Behind Me, which again is going for that. I then get access to an ability upgrade. So of all the existing abilities I have, I can then pick an upgrade that changes how that ability works. This allows me to further specialize the class to my playstyle. So say I wanted that Forceful Strike to get better, there's one that I could change it from strength based damage to agility based damage, and I can also do bleed once the enemy's armor's gone. Or potentially I could increase the strength damage bonus that I do, and they suffer traumas when I break through their armor. Potentially I could also change how my charge and endure works, but one of the new changes as well is charge and endure are mutually exclusive. You can't use both of them in the same round, which is a very interesting change. If I then look at Cog's level 6, I get access to new specializations. So I could take something like Tactical Movement Specialization, which would give him more reflexes, more mobility, as well as enhancing his agility and toughness. And what that would do is it also give me new access to talents and modifications. I can't really pick dual weapon specialist because he can't actually dual weapon and he can't really want to be using medium armors. But you could take, say, anti-armor specialist, which is going to be enhancing his perception and his intelligence, as well as giving him access to feats that will allow him to quickly strip armor. Because Cog is a larger character, I actually do like the idea of going tactical movement specialist because it also gives me some toughness here. So it is quite useful to go into. But then I get access to modifications. So again, as I showed before, these come based on your talents and your specializations, your archetypes and your specializations, as well as your other stuff. And what we have access to here was we have our warrior-based ones, we have our tactical movement-based ones from the one I just picked, and our heavy armor ones. And what this will do is it will show you that you just slot the modification onto an ability. And like I said, you can only have one per each. But it also shows you the potential abilities that you can tie it to, so you won't ever accidentally pick something that you can't use, and you'll be able to see what effects that you already have on your existing ones. So if you've already got one on them, you might not think that you'd want to go there, and you can check to see what other modifications that you can get to basically help simplify the build, but without dumbing down how the leveling system works. I think this is going to be the main point of how you customize your builds, and whereas in Rogue Trader you could have two people that both play Warrior Arc Militant, a layman might think that that's two exactly the same build, but they could have 20 different talents, whereas this one, because you have very obvious subclasses differences, you're going to have much different passives as well as access to different abilities, and it will very incrementally and slowly give you new options to not overwhelm yourself. Yes, there are going to be some people that want to plan ahead for up to their level 25, but that's equally fine and also a valid choice. When it comes to combat, you're going to notice a lot of changes very quickly. Up here we have the overall morale victory, so this is your percentage towards just instantly winning the encounter. Here we have on this blue marker the enemy's morale, with the white one being their health bar and the bottom red one being their wounds bar. You have much more verticality, as you'll see enemies on the higher ground, and you'll also have these signs for cover here. These cover signs will sometimes just have their own health bar, and they will take damage if you try to shoot through them. So chances are that your shots will have to try to penetrate through that, or they'll have to destroy the cover to be able to hit the person behind it, but sometimes shots will get it. Area weapons like flamers will bypass cover, but weapons like melters and shotguns won't. The combat is a lot more tactical. You have less resources to use, you have turn stacking just like before with officers returning, and officers being just as OP as they were, but for a different reason now. Whereas before officers were OP because they could stat buff, officers are OP in this one because they can morale buff. Morale is the key to winning. You'll also notice that you have concentration abilities which will activate here, which is an enemy trying to close this door. So he's used his turn to start this ability here, and if we do anything that can interrupt concentrations, we can cancel that ability. Just like another enemy here is attempting to execute a prisoner, which could have implications on the story if I don't stop the execution. Now, there are ways that I can choose to stop it. I could try to use a psychic power to interrupt him, but that will use my attacking action until I have upgrades that doesn't cost my attacking action. So if I make an attempt here, he had to make a check to pass it, and he did pass it. Now, because of the way I've leveled, my assail will actually go to other targets, but it did fail for here. So we can see that some of the other people actually became stunned whilst I was trying to get him because of the way that works. Now, the other things that you'll see is you'll have more ways to set up movement for your allies. So some of these companions here, I can actually set up abilities to be able to use stuff like being able to move them and other supporting powers. There is a lot of changes being done to the way that Psychic Origins work, but I'll go more into that after the combat phase. If I enable audio, one thing you'll also notice is the difference in the sound and effects. A lot of work has actually been put into this, so if I use an ability like Firestorm here, you'll get a good sense of the sort of things I'm talking about with the change to the sounds. And they also have a lot of new abilities, so you're able for Psychicers to be able to lower the veil and increase it. Depending on where the veil is, depends on your chance to not only increase the damage of your Psychic powers, but also have chances of bad things happening. Some of this can actually increase the skill checks required for enemies to save against your attacks. There's a lot of new powers that we can go into and go over in the build crafting section, but I overall am very much enjoying the combat changes. A lot of people want to know, is this better than Rogue Trader? It's different. It's a much different system, but it's a much more enjoyable system. If you are a fan of Divinity Original Sin 2 and Baldur's Gate 3, but you weren't the biggest fan of Rocket Tag style system of Rogue Trader, you'll probably actually enjoy this version of the game a lot more. It is focused more on tactical gameplay, and it will be a lot more familiar to people that play those sorts of games. So for people that are looking to go maybe in that direction, like I said, you'll probably enjoy this a lot more than previously with the current version. Some of the things that have changed is abilities like burst fire are now single target, but they can sometimes go off. So if I shoot for this guy, pretty much all the shots are going to go for him, with only the odd random shot going off to other targets within this zone. So if we have a look at that, see, only one or two are going off targets with someone else, whereas normally and before, everything in this direction would have just been deleted. And as you can see, enemies set up grenades to be used with those late turns that I could have tried to interrupt with a precision weapon like a sniper rifle or a sword. As I said, combat here is clearly more tactical, and you have to sort of think and plan out your moves more. Now, turn advantage can sometimes mean if you even have the potential to interrupt what you want them to do, because my main character for interrupting does it on AoE, which is Epone here. However, I didn't even have the chance to use her until now. Unfortunately, it does appear that they are still using stat blocking, so people who aren't a fan of that initiative system in Rogue Trader, unfortunately, it does return. When it comes to officers are just going to be as ridiculous as they always were, but for a different reason. Now they buff morale rather than directly to stats, and by buffing morale, they can actually do a lot for their companions. Extra turns return, but they're not as game-breaking as they were, but they are still very viable and useful, and in some cases mandatory, but in a different way. So you will need to use extra turns because you are massively outnumbered by enemies in these encounters, but it's not going to be as game-changing as it was. Even when you give a Finest Hour now works more like a Bring It Down, but with 3 AP instead of 2 AP, as well as giving only a small amount of movement. As you can see, sniper rifles are a lot more effective, even though I didn't go for a precision attack there, and there are items to have multiple attacks from these precision-based attacks, and killing enemies will actually give you the ability to get heroic actions coming in here. So, as I said before, Finest Hour has made a change. It's now just a small extra turn with just a little bit of AP, rather than as game-breaking as it was before, but you can still use it to stack up multiple actions and to really get the flow of combat going in your favor. However, like I said, you're not going to be able to just solo the entire encounter from those actions yourselves, and because of the nature of some of the combats, there are sometimes you just won't be able to get through, such as to get through in here to fight these guys. Before they execute prison's open door, I needed to have a melter charge with me. Because I didn't have a melter charge, I can't get in, but that is going to be something that we'll cover when we talk a little bit more about itemization. Whilst we are talking about combat, I want to briefly go over some of the itemization changes and how some of the roles have changed. So as I said, flamers themselves, they now have a much better way to use them with area, because it guarantees that you do damage to someone that's in the area, so every cell will do damage. It will also sort of bypass cover. When it comes to stuff like the melters will not bypass cover, but it will damage everything in the area, but it does extra armor damage, so it is very good at stripping armor, though it then becomes a little bit weaker afterwards, but their base damage tends to be higher than flamers anyway, so it's still quite effective at getting to those fleshy bits, and the extra burning damage from flamers will do extra damage to armor as those dots tick over. Whilst I didn't get to test much of them in the beta, it seems that you do get some very decent stuff coming in from plasma. Now, I've seen some plasma with higher armor damage, so I don't know if it scales a little bit of intelligence, but like I said, I wasn't able to test it. But they have a good range of single shots, overcharge shots, and obviously area attacks. Some people reported that when you use run and gun, which is meant to give you a second attack with a area or a single target shot, sometimes this would apply to the single target shot of plasmas, which was a bit odd. However, they do have some really good extra effects coming in here, and they can do extra damage, and they also have damage that will scale with their tech use, so that this is another way that they sort of have more of an identity to them, though it is a bit weird that it always gets tied to tech use with Hellcat, because obviously if you've played stuff like the Dawn of War games, elite squads will also use plasma weapons, and these aren't going to be very tech savvy people, it's going to be your generic soldiers, but I do like the sort of change that we're seeing there. As previously stated, burst weapons are now a single target ability. It will fire multiple shots that will go for that primary target, and your chance of deviation, instead of just going off the random target and hitting everything in its line of path, it will just hit one single target. Currently, rapid fire is bugged in the alpha, and it will randomly target cover instead of enemies, but that's just something that we're dealing with for now. I imagine that's something that's going to be fixed in full release. Stuff like chain weapons now have the ability to do extra wound damage, which will also apply to bolters, which is kind of nice. So that gives them more of an identity there. However, we don't seem to have armor pen. Bolters are specifically designed to punch through armor, then explode people on the inside of their explosive rounds. So I was hoping that they would do a percentage of armor pen. So say you do 6 damage and you do 5 extra wounds damage, but if you have, say, 20% of that damage will actually bypass armor, so you do 6 damage to the armor, and then that 20% of that 6 damage will then apply directly to health, and then you'll get the extra wounds damage. I thought that would have been cool, but it seems that at the current version of the alpha, there is no armor pen. There's just damage reduction, and some abilities have the ability to ignore damage reduction. Las weapons will get extra arm penetration, and they are incredibly potent. Enemies with Las rifles will melt your tank characters, and it is dreadful to see. You also have sniper rifles that either have high single target damage, or they'll have lower damage but with like extra armor damage, or they'll have lower damage with extra vitals damage. Again, precision targets do extra vital damage is very key to being able to kill people, especially for operatives. When it comes to that archetype, they do get a lot of bonuses for stacking extra damage when you're doing vitals, but it is mostly item dependent, and with it being item dependent, that means that in a lot of cases an officer will snipe just as effectively as a operative, and it will actually be very reliant on having a psyker character to be using debuffs and stuns to be able to even precision target. I feel like Operative is very weak on its own to the point that it's unplayable, and there's no reason to pick it over an Officer, because an Officer will do much more for your party. However, to caveat that, when you then add in a Psycho debuffer that can guarantee you to always get headshots and eye shots, they become very potent. It will have to see how their hit chances go on into the later game, because I believe that as they become less reliant on party combos, they'll just get exponentially stronger, because then when they also have party combos, they'll be very, very strong. One of the other item changes is it now costs a lot of money to use consumables, and I found that every time you failed a skill check, it was very, very punishing. I would like to see the money system slightly changed, because obviously you can make money through selling junk, but most of that's going to be going into your failed skill checks to, well, get that back. Chain weapons do extra wound damage, as I previously said. Plasma weapons seem to get sometimes scaling from your intelligence or tech use, but not always, as in the case with this plasma pistol that doesn't, so they might still be playing around with it. The reason they seem to have locked it behind state 2 and you can't get in the default state 1 is probably because they haven't quite finalized how they want to do plasmas. A lot of the items I said are very good, where you have stuff like your armor durability tied to it. Your origin bonuses from the world that it's made from seem to be very consistent, and you do have some special weapons like, say, the Ripper that can be used in close quarters training, and soldiers now have their rate of fire talents tied directly to their archetype rather than items, which makes all soldiers more viable. If Ulfar was in Dark Heresy, he'd be a lot more powerful than he is in Rogue Trader, but I would like to be able to test more stuff like the heavy bolters, because obviously bolters do an extra wound damage, but like I said, at this time I didn't get a chance to test it because it was hidden behind a faction reputation that I wasn't able to achieve in my first few runs. Let's talk a little bit about the cast that we have access to in the alpha. So the player-made character, John Dark Heresy here, is a Imperial Noble Origin officer. Officer works by buffing morale and debuffing enemy morale, as well as giving extra turns. This is incredibly potent and actually what determines if you win or lose combat. It is the most impactful class in the alpha, and it is not even close to how good it is. Basically, you can single-handedly turn the tide of the entire encounter. It's not as OP as officers were in the previous game, where you could just give a final style that gave infinite attacks, but it is a lot more limited in scale, but it's still very, very strong. As I said, with the vitals damage actually being tied to items, you can be just as effective as a sniper as an operative, unless the operative has heavy ally support. So you can do a lot of armor strip if you go for a long last style sniper rifle, and then a lot of direct damage with a regular sniper rifle, and you can get upgrades to do it. And stuff like extra attacks on kill, and obviously extra precision and extra vitals damage is tied to gear, which the officer can use. So if you wanted to be a combat sniper officer, you could, and you would be just as effective as a operative sniper, if not more effective, because you can give out more extra turns. The only things you won't have access to is the self morale enhancement, which an operative does by using vital targeting, but you will be able to give a lot of morale boost to your allies to give out those extra turns. First companion we have access to is Hamar. He is a heavy gunner specialist. This is a single target style weapon, not the burst fire that we're used to in Rogue Trader. Stuff like shotguns I thought would be a good secondary because you can use it in melee, but it turns out they're actually actually really weak and in dire need of a buff because they don't have any pushback anymore, so they don't really feel effective. They hit as hard as a wet noodle, and chances are when you need to armor strip is when the enemy's running into your face. So I ended up building him around dash and just dashing away from enemies and then continue using the heavy stubber. Unfortunately, because this soldier is now quite single target, I kind of felt like soldier and operative were overlapping each other because they were both high damage single target. The only difference was operative when handheld had a higher damage potential, but soldier was just consistently better on its own. So with support they were both incredibly powerful, but the soldier performed slightly better when it wasn't having its handhold, to the point where you could do 200 to 400 damage in a single attack, whereas the operative would only do about 20 damage without handholding, but when it was being handheld it could do 2 like high damage attacks per turn, if not more. So there is quite a bit of an identity to them, whereas operative is now being pushed to be more of a combat role, but a team-based combat role, fighting from range, whereas soldier's more of a I'm on my own and I'm going in Rambo guns blazing. Epione is another soldier companion, and she is someone who has some stuff to specialize into int. With this specialization, she can go into shockwave shots that can help debuff enemy morale, as well as being able to buff allies and heal allies. She builds high into intelligence, so she is quite effective with stuff like melters and flamers, though her damage is not going to be as high as Haymar, but her high mobility and the ability to also buff allies makes her very useful, especially for using area weapons to disrupt enemies. I found that I used Haymar as my high single target damage companion, and my Epione as my interrupter and my morale debuffer, as well as working with the team to keep my team up by being able to go for objectives. Because of her movement specialist, she was able to get to them a lot easier. Cog is one of the first allies we recruit, who this unique Ogren 2x2 companion is a warrior. Whilst he is quite tanky, I found that tanks seem to get shredded a lot easier in this because most enemies seem to use las weapons, which just absolutely melts armor. However, they are very good at being area attackers and being in your frontline distraction. You're not going to leave them as unattended as you did in Rogue Trader, but with the right support they are incredibly powerful and incredibly potent. Because Daring Breach is now gone, he isn't going to solo clear the entire battlefield like he previously would have done. Saros here, who currently has a placeholder, is a Psyker Telepath. He seems to have gone for a specialization into debuff moralization specialist as well as pyromancy specialist. I don't know if he comes default as a pyromancer, but I believe he is default as a telepath. We might actually be able to choose that, or maybe we recruit him once he's already gone into the Psyker discipline. Telepath is focused on debuffing the enemy and shielding allies, whereas pyromancer is specialized on doing damage and applying dots to enemies, and then using those dots like an executioner would to just launch them across the map regardless of line of sight. I found him to be very effective going into a morale debuff specialist, where I could do giant area attacks that would lower enemy morale as well as set them on fire and then burst them down very quickly, as well as also using him to debuff and stun enemies, which would allow my precision based fighters to then take them out. Lefar is a Way Seeker, which is a unique Aldari archetype, but essentially the way it works is he's a Psyker Origin Telepath that's gone into Warrior, and then from Warrior he's built into dual weapon combat. So this gives me an idea of how the Psyker Origin will work, whereas you will get one Psyker school that you'll get the full ability list from. You won't be able to pick a second school unless you go into Mystic, which is the Psyker sort of tier 1 archetype. But as going into a Warrior, he can be built for a mixed attacker, and they built him to be a precision fighter. So he uses 2 swords with some of his willpower bonuses coming in, so he is a bit of a gish build. And as a telepath, he can stun enemies for himself to then do precision based attacks. And he has a lot of talents based around reducing the cost of his precision attacks after using a power. So you could do a 1 AP stun that hits 2 enemies, and then you could do a precision attack for 1 AP, and that would have been the same as just making the precision attack, except when you guaranteed extra damage. So once armor's gone, he will do a lot of damage. You'll probably want to have 2 weapon sets on him. One weapon set that's designed for armor stripping, such as a power weapon, because power weapons seem to have extra armor strip, and then you'll want to go for a precision based sword that's maybe doing extra damage to health, like either force weapons or maybe even some vital weapons if we find them as they come along. Because of this, his Wayseeker Origin gives him unique high mobility options, so he is incredibly useful at just diving enemy back lines and taking out enemy range and support, so he is found to be quite an effective role. The last companion was my least favorite by far, which is a shame because I really like her design, which is Rahakti, however you pronounce that. She is an operative, but she has some really potent origin abilities that actually covers a lot of the weaknesses of operative. She is able to have a weapon where she can use her agility instead of weapon skill, but as one of her origin talents, and that will also allow her to make a melee attack and a shot attack in the same turn, so this is quite effective. The way operative works is it has two modifications that it can use. One that will reduce your damage but apply exploits, and one that will increase your damage and consume those exploits for extra damage. Now, all of the vital damage actually comes from the sniper rifles themselves and directly from gear. There is a few talents that come in from operative, but not that many. A lot of the precision specialization that you can use on operative, which can also be used by warrior with swords, is actually where a lot of your damage is coming in. In the first few levels, I found that the crew and my sniper officer did the exact same damage, and people making arguments why operative was OP, I was able to do the exact same damage with my officer. It isn't until I actually used two operatives that I noticed that they could do a lot of damage, and then when I started heavily specializing Lothar and Saros to stun enemies to get more access to vitals, I found that operative had a lot of talents that as you do vital points damage, you can increase heroics, so they can turbo generate heroics to then do incredibly high damage single shots. This is what then defines them apart from soldier, whereas soldiers are just by themselves tanky high damage. Operatives are very squishy and their high damage requires party combinations, so a smart player might actually find that operatives do better on harder difficulties just because of the amount of stun support, but it depends on where the game design is going. If it's going to be a CC heavy fest where it's going to be about high area stun and then picking off targets with that, then yes, operative would be very valuable. If it doesn't, then obviously they will be less valuable. That remains to be seen, but I'm still hopeful, but I am a little bit worried that operative is going to be too item reliant to have multiple in the party when you kind of want multiple, and at the end of the day I might be questioning, would I really take an operative over a burst soldier which fulfills the same role, or even just adding another officer which might make it easier to win. Like I said, I am hopeful and I very much like the specializations, because specializations seem to be tied into what talents you get access to, what abilities you get access to, and how your skills increase. On the topic of investigations, which is going to be your main objective in each of the acts as you go through the game, you sort of build up a mind map as you discover clues, and this will update. You'll have options to research it based on what your companions have been up to, or even their insights, or even other clues that you've picked up, and then you'll be able to come to conclusions based on evidence that you found, and you may find evidence that then conflicts the conclusions you've already made. So a lot of this is going to be very interesting, and it's going to enable multiple run-throughs of the game. However, one concern I have had with this so far is some of your clues are going to be tied to which route you take. Without giving too many spoilers, there's a section of the game that you can either join and pretend to be a member of a cult to get into, or you can solve puzzles to get into that section. However, if you go through the puzzle section, you get access to much better items, but you lose access to finding out who's really the mastermind of the cult, and instead you only have the option to blame the cult for the incident, and you don't have the option to blame whom they were actually worshipping. So this is something that I believe could be a little bit of an issue, especially when it comes to building your companions, as you'll need to take certain specializations to not fail skill checks, because failing skill checks locks you out of clues, and you only get one option to make those checks. So being locked out of the investigation because you failed a skill check might feel really unrewarding to a player, and especially if you lose access to items or certain routes. So if I know that I have to go one route to be able to get the correct story choices, but I know that the better items and the better factions are locked behind the other route, this can be quite difficult. This means that on higher difficulties, if I want to min-max my builds for combat, that means I'm going to suffer in the story, and if I need to maximize my builds for the story, that means I could suffer in combat. So this is going to be a very delicate tightrope for Owlcat to go over. Overall, the narrative and the storytelling I feel like were absolutely exceptional. The world building and the feel and the aesthetics of the world, as well as the music design, sound design, the general combat, the sort of flow of combat, the verticality, and all the different changes there have been a drastic improvement to Rogue Trader. The game feels much more modern than a previous top-down game, where before it was just kind of going into abilities. You can really see Owlcat bringing together everything they've learned. There were a few quest workflow bugs and a few triggers that actually bricked my run a few times that I actually had to get the developers to point out how to cause these triggers because it wasn't very obvious. And since falling for these pitfalls, I've actually found multiple other users that had the exact same issue of needing to talk to an unmarked NPC that wasn't highlightable, and it wasn't in the journal to say that you needed to talk to them to even be able to trigger the events there and the flags, which would then allow you to progress the quest line to where you actually needed to be. So this was a bit of a nuisance to me, and I hope it's stuff that gets ironed out for the full release. There was also issues where you could sometimes be locked out of story paths because sometimes you could accidentally lock off dialogues by upsetting NPCs, and then much later, several hours later, you might find that you actually need that NPC to even be accessing certain routes and paths available in the game, which you've been locked out of because you've met them too early. There were also some other issues that I found that sometimes certain quest givers would disappear because of other side quests happening, which meant I couldn't turn in rewards to get the level up to go do the combat that I needed to do to be able to actually get that NPC to return. So that was a bit of a nuisance to me. Overall, bugs were few and far between, but I am very keen at seeing what they do with conviction and alignment choices going into the future, and how they're going to balance the faction reputation rewards. Currently, I don't like the money system or the reputation system, because I feel like it's too punishing and too restrictive. I don't want to have to always be mean to a certain vendor to get the best items, and then nice to vendors that I might not want to be nice, because it will impact my story to be able to make those builds. And as someone that likes to do build crafting creation, I don't want to be making build guides that locks your story progression, because I could ruin someone's playthrough by saying, to get the best build in the game, you need to do this, and you need to do that, and you need to get that item, and then it locks off entire routes to those players. That's something that I feel like is a bit bad, and I'm hoping it's something, again, that Owlcat will be able to iron out for the full release. When it comes to the new level up system, I think that is absolutely fantastic. I do like the idea of having multiple access to different subclass styles that you get from, say, like a 5e edition from Dungeons & Dragons, where at level 3 and level 6 I get to pick a subclass that will actually change what talents I have available to and what modifications I have available to, as well as giving me boosts to different areas. But like I said, I am a little bit worried that some of the best stuff that I want for certain builds will actually be tied and limiting my playstyles. So far, I do believe that there's going to be support for Gish-based builds, because obviously if you start with Psych Origin, you can pick any Origin and you can go into any Tier 1 archetype, and you just have access to that one Psyker school and not the others, and you don't have access to the Mystic-based things. You won't be able to be as power specialized, but you will still get the benefits. If you go Telepath on, say, an Officer, you can be a debuff specialist, or like Lafar, you can do it on a Warrior and become someone that debuffs them, stuns enemies, and then is able to precision attack base themselves, or you could even potentially go a ranged Pyromancer that can be dropping a mixture of ranged spells as well as some heavy bursts or area attacks. So there's a lot of potential there, and I can see it being a very fun build system. As for when it comes to Mixed Attacker, I've not seen any specializations that support Mixed Attacker, but there are a few items around there. I do hope it's something they build into a little bit more, and like I said, I think once we have our Tier 2s and once we see beta, I think there is a lot of potential to this build system, and I'm very keen that I'll be able to make a good full year of build videos for people, just like I did with Rogue Trader. With the modification system, I think builds are going to be very interesting. As you can see here, from the Imperial Noble Origin, we get something like a debuff specialization coming in from our Origin, as well as being able to go into Demoralization Specialist, which gives another one. We'll be able to use both of these along with some of our modifications where we can actually lower enemy morale even more, and increasing our own. So an officer from an Imperial Noble will actually be very good at manipulating enemy morale and buffing our own. So here, potentially, we can lower enemy morale by 3 to 5, as well as another 1 on top, or another 2 on top, sorry, and increase our own by 2, as well as then buffing an ally 1 by 4 with the right items and modifications coming in here that we can see at the bottom, as well as items as well, and then increasing allies damage where based on morale when we then pop that in. We can even then get stuff where we actually do more damage to enemies ourselves with stuff like 10% more damage against non-disposables against enemy officers. So there's a lot of build potential here, and a lot of stuff that's going to go into these modifications, which I think will actually create quite a wonderful and deep system. So all in all, this is going to bring us back to our final conclusion. Do we think this is better than Rogue Trader, and do we have high hopes? Whilst it's different, I'm not going to say it's better or worse, but it does look like a very promising upgrade. Whilst it's going in a different direction, I think they're really polishing and refining a lot of their systems and aiming at bringing in a bigger audience. Yes, I know to some die-hard CRPG fans, hearing that this game's going to be more like Baldur's Gate 3 and more like Divinity Original Sin 2, which is a comparison I railed against before going into alpha, now that I've had my hands on it, I can see where they've taken inspiration and where it does seem to be very effective. So I am very hopeful for what they're doing. I just hope that they really look into some core things, such as making sure that operatives are going to scale well into the end game and they're not going to be as useless as they are in Rogue Trader, making sure that officers' morale manipulation isn't too overpowered, and making sure that item locking isn't going to be based on your story pass and it's going to tie you out of some of the best builds in the game, and also restrict which difficulties you can play on depending on which story path you're going, as well as those annoying little things of just how much it can cost to fail skill checks and how much we'll need to min-max that, which could impact our combat effectiveness if we're trying not to spend all of our money on having to buy consumables to get around that. Like I said, I very much like the new quest-based system and the sort of environmental storytelling that we have on display here, such as world states being changed based on decisions made in previous acts, and also how our investigations unfold, though I don't like that I sometimes feel locked out of the correct answer because I chose to go right instead of going left. This is something that came up on my live stream, that someone points out that I got the wrong option at the end of the game. He said that you're meant to accuse the Night Lords and I accused the Heretic cult. It's essentially the same answer, but the thing is, if I had gone left, I would have been able to accuse the Night Lords, but because I went right, that wasn't even an option. So whilst I was able to steal points to the right faction, I wasn't able to report who their boss was. Whilst for me, that didn't bother me, but it seemed to very much upset him. So that means that that is something Alcat are going to need to consider, that the fact that failed skill checks, and depending on which path that you pick, can lock you out of getting the correct choice. Now, as long as the game doesn't try to punish you for it, that will be absolutely fine. However, I can already see where the game is punishing you for it based on what items you have access to. Of the two faction vendors that we had access to, one of them I wanted to be very nice to get the best items, the other one I wanted to be very mean to get to the best items, but for story reasons I wanted it the other way, so I got forced to play a story that I didn't want to play just so I could get the items I wanted. So this is something that some people will be fine with, other people won't be, but it's stuff to consider. For anyone who is interested in trying out the alpha themselves, we've just finished doing a code giveaway, so unfortunately it is too late to join that. However, if you buy the Digital Developers Edition, you can get in yourself, and you'll also get into beta. But if you just want to wait to the full release, that is also perfectly valid, because you can always just see what I've done on my streams and watch some of the videos I've got coming up on each of the companions, and I will go into deeper dives of each of the companions soon. But that's all I've got for you today. I hope you found this informing. If you've got any other questions, do let me know or come on the Discord and ask directly. Till next time, I'm Evan, and I will see you around.